Next, our penultimate speaker is Romulo Sampaio, who's a professor of environmental law at the Vargas Foundation, who will talk about COVID-19 cities and governance. Professor Sampaio.
Good morning, good afternoon, good night to everyone. I would like to start by congratulating this important initiative, the Global Pandemic Network, and Professor Elizabeth Scotty from the kind invitation, on behalf of whom I extend, of course, my gratitude to all of those who helped putting this together. A special thanks to my dear friends, Karen Johnston and Professor Julian Jürgensmeyer with Georgia State University College of Law. Special thanks to Professor Nick Robinson, with whom I had the pleasure to share great years of my life in New York, studying at Pace, and all of those who are here today with us. I could start speaking about the importance of international organizations in a more theoretical framework on the issue of governance. Could talk about common set of principles, proportionality, reasonableness, the need to avoid arbitrary local decisions, and all the more very general and very important theoretical issues we need to address. But instead, however, I think for the purpose of these discussions, I decided to offer you a case study with the help of a great researcher who works with me here, Julia Massadas, to put together some empirical data I collected from Brazil. I think Brazil could offer great grounds for discussion as a case study because it's very big, it's very diverse, and it's very complex in terms of what we're seeing in the pandemic context. But before I show you this data, I just want to highlight very briefly that from a regulatory standpoint and a decision-making standpoint, we need to recognize that we are still at a stage of great uncertainty. And uncertainty is always a big variable of decision-making theory. So therefore, many regulatory decisions we are experiencing around the world are, or at least should be, designed taking a preventive approach, or some would call a precautionary approach, but also without undermining the fundamental values of democracy, the need for measures to be cost efficient whenever possible, individual freedoms, and I think most important, solidarity. After all, resources are limited and we need to take very good care of them. So governance can help or can enhance the dangers imposed by COVID-19. And I think the Brazilian data I'm going to offer you perhaps helps us to highlight some of the issues I think the more theoretical discussions lead us. So I'm just going to try here to share my screen. Okay, thank you. So sorry about that. The guiding questions that I want to focus the attention of my presentation on cities and governance is why COVID-19 unfolds differently among countries, regions, and cities. How politics, policies, or even governance play a role here. Or are we saying that a combination of intertwined and complex variables can play an important role? How does social inequality weights in? Is it possible to overcome social inequality in the fight against pandemics? And I will bring some examples of slums that were just mentioned previously in some of the presentations. Is progress in contemporary urban planning and management threatened? I think there are issues we need to address when we talk about densification, anti-gentrification policies, individual freedoms, data privacy, sustainability, and so many other concepts that evolved so much in previous decades in the urban law environment. And then I'm going to offer you this Brazilian perspective of focusing on this more empirical data, because again, it's a very big, diverse, large, and unequal country. I would just like to offer you, to begin with, a provocation of whether we are seeing or witnessing the end of the era of nation states. We are currently a very urbanized world, and we're going to be a much more urbanized world in 2050, with the United Nations projecting almost 70% of the population in cities. And our important thinkers are questioning whether technology and social networks are increasing the polarization of the political spectrums, because people now tend to focus more on the kind of news that they want to read. So that there are many important reports about that, undermining the notion of nation states. In Latin America, we are already a very urban continent. We're talking about rates that go over 80% of the people living in urban areas. So when we look at some of the social variables that weights in, and we look how COVID unfolds differently in different countries, regions, and cities, we find already studies showing an important correlation among inequality and greater impact of COVID-19. So this graphic is showing that more equal countries did a better job in testing and monitoring and keeping the pandemic under control. If we move to the Brazilian example, which I want to focus with some of the empirical data we collected, we've seen a great governance failure, not at the nation, not only at the federal government, but state and even municipalities. We have almost 2 million confirmed cases with 75,000 deaths already confirmed. We are the second countries in absolute numbers, just behind the United States. So what happened in Brazil is being written by many scholars here in Brazil and around the world. It's a politicization of the virus. And this politicization of the virus has had great impact on governance issues at the very local level. At the very beginning, we had at the federal government a denial that the virus was as deadly as it was seeming. And so the Supreme Court took measure to say that local decisions at the city level and at the state's level would preempt any federal government. So the Supreme Court said that the local governments had authority to impose social distance and even lockdown measures. That solved an apparent negationist federal approach, but led to an uncoordinated actions among regions and cities. We've already fired the Ministry of Health, and we've been holding the most important position at the federal level at interim basis with the general from the military. So that's being deemed as very bad for the good governance we need to tackle the virus. So what we're seeing is an increased polarization of political spectrums within the virus, an even bigger increase, with impacting on behavior of the people, leading to poor governance and exacerbating social inequality, the variable and how it affects the responses on COVID. And those impacts, unfortunately, are primarily felt by the poor living in mega cities. This is a slide showing some of this heretical behavior and dangerous behavior during a pandemic in the country that requires social distance and lockdown. The bottom right picture is the president in street protests right in the middle of the pandemic without due care for masks and any other social distance measures. When we look at the inequality at a broader sense in the country, we've always read from scientists that the group of risk was those over 60 years old, the elderly. But in Brazil, we found out that because of poor governance, the group of risk are really the very poor. The state of Amazonas, which is at the very north part of the country where the rainforest is located, has 72 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. The state of Rio Grande do Sul in the very south, much lower rates of deaths. And when we look at the per capita income of those states, we can have a feeling of some of the explanations for that. The North region is most proportionally affected by COVID-19. It's region with the country's youngest population. The South region is the one less affected by the virus, and it's the country's oldest population. So we can see how bad governance can really shift science around in terms of groups of risks. So when we look to inequality and how social inequality within cities itself, we have some even more preoccupying data when we look at cities in Brazil, especially infrastructure, income, and access to water. The green states are the ones with better infrastructure and income per capita and access to water, and also those performing better in combating COVID-19, cities within those green states. The ones in reds are the ones most affected by COVID with the most deadly rates. And if we take a look to access of water, then it's really preoccupying, because water is an essential asset as a preventive measure against the virus. So we look at the access to water data in Brazil, we see that only 5 state capitals have 100% of the population with access to water supply. In Porto Velho, the capital of a northern state, this rate is only 35%. So only 35% of a major city in the North region has access to water. So then we can start to see how bad governance impacts, makes COVID even more deadly. When we look at the data of densification, as densification is deemed to be a big factor for contamination, we have to ask whether it's densification alone that it causes the higher contagious rates, or whether these are poor housing conditions. If we look at the data in Brazil of cities with houses that have more than 3 inhabitants per domicile, we see that those are the most poor cities with the poor housing conditions. So the data indicates here that it's not densification alone that helps the contamination rate of the virus, rather it's poor housing conditions. So that's what this data is showing right here. And I think New York is an example of that. It had a big contagious rate, but it managed to get it under control. And in Brazil, what we're seeing is that poor housing conditions are really undermining the impact of it's undermining the fight against COVID-19. Poverty is another big factor, as we see the cities in states where per capita income is the lowest in the country, and states with higher income do much better here in the graphics than those poorer cities. Inequality is also a big player again, where inequality is bigger, the rates of success in combating COVID-19 is lower. And to the contrary, lesser inequality, better governance. Race and gender inequality has been a big variable studied by COVID in Brazil, major Brazilian cities. We have seen a greater increase of domestic violence against women. Women are suffering more in jobs in greater cities in Brazil. And also African Brazilians are being most affected because they're also within the most poor layer of the Brazilian population. Corruption is skyrocketed because of COVID, and that's a big issue for a good governance in cities. Has been investigations going on because of the emergency contracts of supply equipment. We see data here from the ventilators paid and contracted for were delivered. In some states, the price paid for ventilators were 5-6 times more than market prices. But there are good news. One of the biggest favelas in the country, slums in the country, in the city of São Paulo, has found a way to overcome the governance problems and infrastructure deficit in major cities. So this Paraisópolis favela in São Paulo, through citizens groups organized themselves. They trained 420 what they call street presidents, volunteering to monitoring households. They hire doctors. They put in place protocols for removing contaminating people. They train 240 residents as rescuers. They use public schools to isolate confirmed cases. They promote distributions of donations and so on and so forth. So this is a good example of how we could overcome the poor governance with a good citizenship engagement. Towards the end of my presentation here, the impacts on cities, we are seeing a great increase and acceleration in technology, but we need to ask whether this acceleration in technology and progress within cities are creating bigger problems or are creating better solutions. Home office, will it lead to decreased vehicle miles travel? If it leads to urban sprawling and gentrification? Technology, are we talking about surveillance and control? We have to pay attention of issues of data privacy and also the regulation of autonomous vehicles and deliveries. So are we witnessing smart cities or controlled citizens? And I think a fair question to ask is regulation keep up with the fast forward pace in technology imposed by the pandemics? And on a final note, I want to highlight issues around sustainability and ask ourselves whether the good news in decreased pollution, as we're seeing here, the cities of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro before and after the pandemic, and China, the Beijing area before and after the pandemic, showing the great reduction in air pollution. São Paulo and New York City, how it drastically reduced mobility. Here is data from New York City before the pandemic and after the pandemic, and the same in São Paulo. But we need to ask whether those are sustained in the long term after we get rid of the pandemic. So on a concluding note, I just want to highlight that all of those issues that could make up for a presentation itself add to the problem of governance failure. And I think the most deadly combination is the one that we're currently having in many cities in Brazil and I guess around the world, that COVID-19 plus governance failure can lead to even more deadly combinations. So we need to do a better job in coordinating public policies, in putting anti-corruption schemes in place. We need to pay closer attention to the infrastructure and housing conditions of our big cities. In developing countries, we need to do a better job in providing water and sanitation services. And of course, poverty and inequality is a challenge that we all need to face because as the data suggests, that has a huge impact on how we deal with global pandemics at the very global to the most local stage. With that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to learning more with the other participants.